Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the International Conference on Iran election, the impact, the fallout of the Iranian election, and in behalf of the Global Counterterrorism Council, I welcome you all. And I thank Aditya for inviting me to chair this session. I'm sure it's going to be of a great interest with distinguished guests on the panel, which have already created a buzz for me because some old friends are already on the panel and some new faces which we have already shared previously. And it will be a great pleasure to look at the Iranian angle from the South Asia and the global perspective. I stress on South Asia for two reasons. One is because of the importance of the geopolitical location of Iran in the north-south by what we call the Trans-Asia connection, and also in the impact of Iran's role in the Afghanistan affairs after the American pullout. And how do we see the American and the Iranian deal as the discussion in Geneva is taking place? And there are many news we are getting the feedback from there. There is a breakthrough that could be very soon we might find a new way of compromise on the nuclear deal. And then all this will have a strong impact on the future of stability in the Persian Gulf, in South Asia, and also in the relation between the United States and Iran, which will have a great implication in Middle East, especially in the Syrian issue, in the Yemeni issue, and also in the Palestinian and on Lebanon. So therefore, without further delay, I would like to invite every guest on the panel to speak for 8 to 10 minutes. And I would like to make a small introduction before the start of each distinguished speaker. My first speaker will be Mr. Oshank Amir Ahmadi. He holds a PhD in International Development of Cornell University and a Distinguished Service Professor at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. He is also a Senior Associate Member of Oxford University, UK Professor. Amir Ahmadi has served as the founder and a director of the University and the Center of Middle East Studies, and as a chair and a graduate director of his department at the Boston School of Planning and Public Policy. He is the founder and president of American-Iranian Council, and also was a candidate for the president of Iran in 2013 and 2017. Welcome, Mr. Ahmadi. And Amir Ahmadi, sorry.
Thank you very much.
It is a very long list, but we will post all his detail of each speaker on the panel after the discussion. So I don't want it to go further because he is a man of the hour, and I'm very happy to read all about his background. The second speaker is Mr. Yuva Matan, who is also a public diplomacy strategist and a senior foreign policy analyst. He has taught in a number of Iranian university and academic centers, including the International Relations Faculty of Iranian Foreign Ministry. Welcome to the program. Of course, we have also a former Pakistani retired diplomat, Mr. Abdul Basit, who is a dear friend who has been served in India as the High Commissioner of Pakistan. And I'm sure that many of my colleagues who are on the panel or who is listening to us will remember him and remember his hospitality and his way of conducting diplomacy in India during his tenure as the High Commissioner in India. Of course, he is a former, he was appointed in his position 2014 and was based as the Pakistani High Commissioner in New Delhi. Previously, he served as the Pakistan ambassador in Germany from May 2012 to March 2014. During his career, he has been posted at Moscow, New York, Sanaa, Geneva, and London. Welcome to the program. We have also Mr. Yuva, Mr. Fuad Azadi. He is an associate professor at the Faculty of World Study, University of Tehran, where he is teaching MA and PhD courses in American Study. Azadi received his PhD from Louisiana State University. He earned his PS in Economics and MA in Mass Communication from University of Houston. Azadi research and teaching interests are interdisciplinary and focus on the United States-Iran relation and US public diplomacy. Welcome to the program, Mr. Azadi. We have also with us Dr. Louise Kettle. He's an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Nottingham. Her research focused on British foreign policy, specifically Britain-Middle Eastern relations. Her latest book, Learning from the History of British Intervention in the Middle East, looks at the British military intervention in the region since the Swiss crisis and how the Foreign Office, Ministry of Defense, and the Intelligence Agency have tried to learn from this experience. She is just starting her new research project and the focus of the British foreign policy in relation to Iran. Welcome all of you. My name is Dr. Wael Awad. I am the foreign writer and a foreign journalist based in South Asia. I have been in India and in the South Asia for the last 4 decades, covering wars, covering development in these parts. I would call Aditya before I start. Yes, Aditya.
Sir, I have lost one speaker. This is Dr. Deepika Saraswati. I have mentioned her profile on the chat box.
Okay, perfect. I will come back to her, and when her turn comes, if you don't mind, because without further delay, I would like to call Mr. Hoshank Amir Ahmadi to start his speech. Befar me awa.
Thank you, Mr. Awad, for a kind introduction. And I say hi to everybody on the panel and everybody listening. It's an honor to speak at this very distinguished group of people. And my hope is that at the end of the session, we will learn a bit what's going on in the country. For this last election was the 13th presidential election in Iran. And obviously it has produced a president called Mr. Ibrahim Raisi, who is a cleric. He was, as you all probably know, was the head of the judiciary branch of the government. Now he will be heading the executive branch. Mr. Raisi was in the judiciary branch for almost all his life, when he was like 18 or 19 years old, all the way to today. So this new job is a really new job, is that he has very little experience in the executive side of governing the country. So, but again, I'm sure he will not be alone. He will have others with him as he moves forward. Now, let me first say a few words about the election itself, and then its implications for Iran and beyond. This election was probably the least open and free election that the Islamic Republic has held over the last 43 years of its life. I mean, compared to the first election, the second, the third, and so on, as we move from the first to today, there is a trend in the Islamic Republic to have increasingly more and more restricted elections. And over the last 3 elections, the presidential election has been, quote unquote, largely engineered. By that, it means that the country, those in power, have tried their best to control who will become president. Now, obviously, that process existed from the very beginning, because Iran's presidential election isn't all that free to begin with. From the day one, it wasn't, except for the first election. The second election onward, a body called the Guardian Council will vet candidates and decide on a few that it thinks are suitable for the executive branch as president. Now, that process has become increasingly more limiting And the wedding has become increasingly more troubling, to the extent that even many very loyal and top officials of the Islamic Republic haven't been able to pass through that particular wedding process. You may all remember that even President Hashemi Rafsanjani was was disqualified for president, even if he was the second man in command for almost 30 some years then. In this very election that I'm talking about, a former president, a former speaker of the parliament, a current vice president, and God knows so many other people were disqualified. And the election and the Guardian Council basically approved 7, of whom really from the very beginning everybody knew that the only one is a serious candidate, who then became the president. Again, in the process, in the election, I mean, this last engineering of the election, I think was a masterpiece. It was really a masterpiece as far as the vetting goes. They vetted people so then they can balance different groups, you know, and for example, they will disqualify Ahmadinejad and Larijani, the former speaker of the parliament, and Ahmadinejad, former president. They disqualified both because these two men more or less are enemies. So if you were to disqualify one and not the other, you will create problem. So you will basically say both of you are out. And they disqualified basically people who were around for 40 some years, and that the Iranian people were not happy with them. In fact, you know, and as you know, in the last several years and elections, the country was divided between the two groups, largely of reformists and principalists. And the Iranian people basically have said to both, we don't want you guys. You better leave. Neither the principalists nor the reformists. We need an alternative, a third alternative. So a lot of these reformists and principalists were also disqualified. Okay, basically, in a way, indirectly telling the Iranian people that, well, you didn't want them, so we disqualified them. But anyway, so I don't want to take your time on the technique and the mastery of this vetting process that took place this time. But that's now history. The fact now is that an election took place and a president was elected. Now, unfortunately, however, this election, because it was so restrictive, it did not produce a lot of enthusiasm on the part of the Iranian voters, and the majority of the Iranians did not participate. The reports that we have from the Ministry of Interior, who basically supervises elections, says that about 48.8%, maybe 40.8%, or a little bit less or more, participated. Some people do object to the number. So the number that are flooded is from 42 to 49.8%. Nonetheless, the majority did not participate. This included not just the opposition to the regime, but also people inside the regime, the people who have been with the Islamic Republic from day one, the reformists, the principalists, and many other groups, including former top officials. So it was a very restrictive election with a uh, less than less than optimum participation of the people. So, and the production is, of course, the president, who is, as I said, the cleric, Mr. Ibrahim Raisi, who has very little executive experience, although his experience in the judiciary is quite vast and quite detailed. In a way, Mr. Ibrahim Raisi now has to learn how to manage the country in the executive branch, and I'm sure he has lots of people on his side to help him. But on the other hand, he, in a way, because he has been for so many years in charge of the judiciary, in a way, I would say he will be also, whether we like it or not, indirectly in control of the judiciary as well. I mean, I'm sure someone is going to be the chief justice in the country, but I believe, given Mr. Raisi's, long experience and tremendous influence on, in that branch, okay, he will indeed be a president which also will have the judiciary somehow very closely under its control. So this is now that Mr. Raisi is becoming president at a very, very tough time. 2 more minutes. Very, very tough time. Mr. Hassan Rouhani, the president, who is the outgoing president, has mismanaged the country tremendously. I mean, again, whether you are for or against him does not change the fact that Mr. Rouhani has been the worst president Iran has had in the last 42 years, from a management perspective, particularly when it comes to the economy. So he really have messed up the country. The country is in serious economic problem, politically too, culturally as well, socially, environmentally, and of course, foreign policy. I mean, whichever way you look at, Iran is in deep crisis, domestic and international. And international, I mean, region and beyond, United States and Europe, the Arab states, particularly Saudis, and you name it. So Mr. Raisi is inheriting a country with deep, multi-dimensional crises. And God help him. I'm not sure how he's going to get on the job and move forward. I will discuss these problems when it comes to my turn later on, maybe in the discussion. But I just wanted to leave you with this statement saying that Mr. Raisi's job will be very, very tough. I just have to pray for him. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like to invite Sayyid Mustafa Khoshisham. He's a public diplomacy strategist and a senior foreign policy analyst. He has taught in a number of Iranian university and academic centers, including the International Relations Faculty of Iranian Foreign Ministry. Aghay, bifarmi.
Greetings to you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to everyone. It's an honor to be with you and others in this panel with distinguished guests. Well, just as an introduction, the problem with understanding Iran starts when the Western world looks at Iran as a role model standing against the United States' legitimate or illegitimate interests in this region. And therefore, the Western media outlets start trying to talk about Iran and to project thoughts to the world that are biased. And this causes double standards, and many are affected, many worldviews are affected by these double standards. Like when in Iran, there is a reformist camp, a principalist camp, bringing up different views, It is said that one camp is standing against the Iranian supreme leader. But when the same happens in the West between the ultra-right parties and the left, or the Democrats and the Republicans, then they call it democracy, checks and balances. When in the West, the president talks about one single united policy, they say that's part of democracy. But when it happens in Iran, they call it dictatorial rule. That has caused some kind of a lack of understanding and improper understanding of what's going on in Iran, especially because Iran represents a model of religious democracy that has not been experienced before. So it's unique. It has to learn. It has to make progress. And it doesn't share much with like the Western culture or some of the systems in the West, in the East. That's why there is so much bias about the Iranian election, for example. It's not practical or possible to let 2,000 people rival in a presidential race. There should be a system for that. In the West, no matter we were talking about Europe or the United States, there is political system, there's partisan system, and these people are filtered and selected through the parties. But in Iran, despite the very fact that we have 230 parties after the revolution, people do not know, even experts do not know even that we have over 230 parties in Iran. They've not heard of their names, let alone the public. Because Iranian public, there are historical roots, cultural roots, civilizational roots, and especially after the revolution, people are not fond of parties. They are fond of figures and individual politicians, and they gather around them. Like they ask, is this list of candidates associated with President Khatami or Ahmadinejad or Ghalibaf? They ask about the figures. That's been proved in so many pollings by international institutes, and as well as the Iranian polling centers and academic centers accredited by international bodies. For the very same fact, in Iran, there has been a system called the Guardian Council with very clear and established rules. This doesn't mean that they are perfect. For sure, they were working in order to improve their standards. But let's remember that when we talk about the Iranian election, we should not focus attention just on the performance of the Guardian Council. Like if there has been less than 50% turnout, according to Tehran University polls that they run, they've been running polls with Maryland University, and their results have been presented at international accredited international bodies and think tanks like the Atlantic Council in the US. They count on them. They've been doing that for over a decade now. They have proved that, the results of their polls, continuous polls, show that between 9 to 11% didn't appear at the polls last Friday because of the coronavirus pandemic in the country. If it hadn't been for that, then we would have something around a 60% turnout, which is normal for Iran. I would like to remind our distinguished guests and audience that a Harvard University research very recently done on the 2020 election in France displayed that at least 20% of the French didn't appear at the polls because of the pandemic, exactly. And it's interesting that in a recent election in 2021 in France, some of the people didn't take part in the election. That was a major portion. But the media outlets, as well as think tanks in the West, they started saying that it's part of democracy. If you vote, it's your right. You also are entitled to the right not to vote. The same thing is true about Iran. But when it comes to Iran, they say, no, this means standing against the establishment. This doesn't seem to be true. Anyway, all the political camps have had their candidates in the election. The reformists, the moderates, the principalists, the revolutionaries, they had their representatives. Some might say that the turnout was low and the candidate for the reformists was not a heavyweight, but that's not true because President Khatami, the father of the reformist movement, as well as Mr. Karoubi, who's been under house arrest and leads the protesters since 2009 presidential election protests, they both called for the public to turn out and support Mr. Hemmeti. And that was done by a number of other distinguished reformist leaders who all called for supporting Hemmeti. Let's remember that when President Khatami 2-3 decades ago appeared in the election, nobody knew him. He headed the National Library and nobody cared about him. Also, the same thing was true about Ahmadinejad. When he was just a mayor, everyone was talking about, 16 years ago when he was elected to power and stood against Hashemi Rafsanjani, and Rafsanjani acknowledged a very bad defeat. He was the mayor. Nobody really cared about Ahmadinejad, and he was not in the news. The same thing is true about Rouhani. Rouhani didn't have a major portion of the public vote. If it hadn't been for Hashemi Rafsanjani, who said Rouhani had no more than 3% vote, if it hadn't been for me and for my support. So this is the feature of the Iranian election. The people that are not known, they appear in the election and suddenly they rise to power because that's what the public wants. They want change. After each 8 years, like after 8 years of reformism, people voted for Ahmadinejad from the principalist camp. 8 years after Ahmadinejad, they voted for Rouhani, who was a strong and fervent critic of Ahmadinejad's path. Now, after 8 years of Hassan Rouhani's failure in ruling Iran and détente with the West and JCPOA, the Iranian public wants a major change in domestic politics, economy, as well as foreign policy. And they voted for Raisi, who was very well known for his campaign against corruption, for his strong management, industrious efforts to improve economy, even though he was the head of the judiciary. He has reopened many plants and factories across the country. Now, when I was invited to talk to his campaign headquarters in the last few weeks, I saw that he was surrounded by at least a team that was as large as 4 cabinet members, former officials and ministers, not just from Ahmadinejad, but from many others. They all were there to help him. And yesterday, hundreds of Iranian diplomats, former and present senior diplomats, wrote a letter to Raisi to underline their support for his policies and for his rule. What I'm going to talk about later in this panel is about the major shift in Iran's foreign policy in the region, in the neighboring countries, in ties with the outside world. But one thing is very important to note. I do believe that the United States and the West, the Europeans, because they have problems with Iran, they would start smear campaign against Raisi to represent him as a radical, as an extremist, while he is not. His foreign policy strategy, which is based on a manifesto of the revolutionary camp that was presented in this election, shows that it's going to be very different from the time of President Rouhani, but it's very much logical. The strategy, the foreign policy strategy to be pursued by Raisi is very pragmatic, as Mr. Arakchi, who's been working for President Rouhani for 8 years and from the reformist camp, he also described the foreign policy of President Raisi as realistic and as pragmatic. And I'm going to explain how and what this strategy is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very valuable input, which is very interesting. And I'm sure that you will steer the debate, especially when it comes to the Iranian foreign policy shift and how it will be under Raisi's presidency. I would like to invite the former retired diplomat, Mr. Abdul Basit, to deliver his note. Please, Ambassador, feel free. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awad. What a pleasure to see you, and what a privilege to be on this panel of such distinguished people, speakers from all over the world. For Pakistan, as you would understand, that Iran is a very important country. It's not only our neighbor, but an important neighbor with a long border, and as well as a member of the OIC. So Pakistan has a special relationship with Iran, and we always would like Iran to be more stable, economically more prosperous, because that also helps Pakistan to stabilize itself. And if our mutual economic relations prosper, that is always that does have a positive impact. Now, and we would very much like Iran to have its issues surrounding its nuclear program resolved, and we hope that the US rejoins the 2015 nuclear deal, because Pakistan having Afghanistan in trouble, then our relations with India in a stalemate. Pakistan cannot have to, Pakistan would not be very comfortable to see another country or another conflict in the region. So we would very much like the US to rejoin the nuclear deal as quickly as possible. Now, with Iran, obviously there is another aspect too, because Pakistan has been trying in the past to see if bridges could be built between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we are very glad to see that some background, some contacts have been established between the two countries in the back channel, and we hope that those contacts would help the two countries to be on the trajectory which takes them to re-establish their relations and put them on a solid, friendly trajectory. Now, with Iran bilaterally, we do have some, problems on the border as well, and there are some bilateral mechanisms which we have established. So we hope that with the new government in place, those mechanisms would serve as vital frameworks to resolve our bilateral issues as well. Then, in the context of Afghanistan, Iran is an important country. And we hope that it will use its influence positively in order to push the present deadlock towards some reconciliation. Iran does have some influence, and we hope that all the neighboring countries of Afghanistan share this responsibility to promote peace in Afghanistan. Obviously, there are an issue of Chabahar port, which some in Pakistan look at with some apprehensions, because that is being, some terminals are being built with the assistance of India, and some in Pakistan look at it as the rival port of Gwadar being built in Pakistan as part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. Now China is getting actively engaged with Iran and investing close to $400 billion as part of its BRI. So if China gets involved, we hope that rather than competing with each other, Chabahar port and Gwadar port will become complementary to each other. So China's involvement, I think, in the region is getting more and increasingly positive in my view. And now US is obviously US President Biden's and the EU's and NATO's declarations that China is the biggest threat to them or to the international liberal world order. That does raise, some questions in our part of the world, because we do not see China as a threat, rather than it's a strategic partner in many respects. Now it is also getting involved in Iran. So China is seen in this region, though it does have border problems with India, but overall China's presence is seen as something constructive and positive. So we hope that that global rivalry between China and the Western world would not impact negatively on South Asia, because such organizations or frameworks like Quad are somewhat disturbing from our perspective, because they are pushing the region or the world as a whole towards confrontation rather than cooperation. So Iran, as a country is an important country, I would say, which has voice and which has influence not only in this region but in West Asia, from Syria to Lebanon and Lebanon to Palestine. Iran does have an important voice. So we seriously believe that sitting in Islamabad, we hope that Iran would, under the new leadership, would be able to resolve its problems, so that Iran, because Iran is facing serious economic problems, and people are, as was very rightly pointed out by Mr. Hamid Hamadi, that how people are losing interest in the political process. So we have seen that the turnout in this election was over 48%, the lowest turnout since the revolution. So we hope that Iran would now be focusing more also on its economic issues, and that cannot happen unless they also resolve some of the problems on the foreign policy front, because both domestic and foreign policy issues go hand in hand. And the biggest issue at the moment is as to when US is able to lift sanctions, and how the US comes back to the nuclear deal. Once that happens, I think that would open many new vistas for Iran to be playing its due role, not only in this region but beyond. So we wish Iran all the best in the coming months under the new leadership, and who knows that Ibrahim Raisi may become, one time the supreme leader. This is what I have been reading in Western media and some of our media as well. So we wish Ibrahim Raisi all the well, and we hope that under his leadership, we would see the democratic norms and principles strengthened, and Iran achieving the pristine goals of its revolution. So we wish Iran all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Very much on time and well said. And I believe you have introduced also new element to the discussion, the role of China influence and the weathering of United States influence in the region, and who is going to fill up the security vacuums in this part of the world. Thank you very much. I would like to invite our speaker, Dr. Fuad Izadi, to deliver his keynote address. Dr. Fuad, please, before me.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Hello to our friends, and hello to our friends that are participating. I'm going to divide my talk in two parts. I'm going to talk about the election a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about Iran's foreign policy after the Raisi administration starts. That's going to be the second part. As your other speakers said, Iran's election this year showed the lowest number of participants in the last 42 years since we had serious elections. Before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, we did not have serious elections because we had a kingdom. The Shah was a brutal dictator, and people did not participate in the political process. And obviously, as you know, the Shah was brought in through a coup d'etat in 1953, and he was supported by the United States and all Western governments without any exception. And then after the revolution, obviously people felt that the government that took over the country through the revolution was theirs. That's why they participated in elections. Iran has had 39 elections in the last 42 years since the victory of the Islamic revolution. So people are concerned that this lower turnout is something that may continue to happen. And so there was this question whether the government has lost a portion of the backing that the government had. Obviously, 48.8% is not that great a number, but this is not uncommon internationally. Just a few days after Iran's election, we had our neighbor Armenia that had an election basically choosing the highest executive officer in that country. And the participation rate in Armenia was 49%, just a little bit more than Iran. And I did not see anybody in the West or elsewhere saying that this is a huge problem for Armenia because of that number. And also, we should remember that the people who could vote in Iran, Iranians eligible to vote, were about 59 million people. 59, almost 60 million people. And so when we calculate 48.8%, it's 48.8% of eligible voters. But something that we need to remember is that about 4 million of these eligible voters live outside Iran. Iran, like India, has a large community of expatriates that live outside. And so if you count the number that were inside the country, that means you subtract 4 million from 60 million, then you get a voter participation of about 53% of the people that actually are in Iran. So you go over 50% basically. And the people who are outside Iran have very difficulties, have difficulties basically going to polling stations. A lot of people, Iranians, live in Canada. Canada did not allow Iran's government to host anybody for the polling. They don't allow presidential elections to be conducted on Canadian soil. In UK, the UK government was nice enough to allow a few polling places in that country, but we had opposition outside polling stations threatening and beating whoever wanted to participate in the polling. And this is the opposition that accuses the Iranian government of not being democratic. But when it comes to voting, they cannot see someone in UK voting in an election that's organized by the Iranian government. So we had incidents of people getting beaten severely for wanting to go and vote. And the Iranian government has objected to the UK government for not protecting these people, and something that they normally do. So that is the first issue. The second issue is, why did we have, so if we take the 53% or 48%, and if you take the 53%, then obviously you get over 50%. But the question is, why did we have less numbers this year? Khoshchesh mentioned one reason. Obviously, we have the coronavirus. About 10% of the people said they did not go to the polls because of coronavirus problems. And this, incidentally, you may know that Iran has difficulty buying vaccines because the US government does not allow Iran to use its reserves outside to do anything, including buying vaccine. For example, in India, Iran has large amounts of money because of the oil sales, and because of US sanctions, the Indian government cannot give that money to Iran And so these are the problems that Iran has. Iran is not a poor country, but because of sanctions, which are inhuman, Iran is not able to buy as much vaccines that it needs. And so Iran is not doing well in terms of vaccinating as many people that Iran wants. Obviously, as you may have heard, Iran is building vaccines internally. There are a couple of vaccines that have gone through the examination processes and are going to be used actually this coming week. One problem was the issue of vaccine. The second problem was the fact that Mr. Rouhani is not a very popular president. And a lot of people who voted for him 4 years ago and 8 years ago did not want to vote for that line of thinking again. Obviously, he could not run for president again, but we have his central bank governor running. We had a former vice president of President Khatami that was running. So the reformists and people who like Rouhani's line of political thinking were present. But the problem that a lot of people had that voted for Mr. Rouhani was that they did not want to vote for that political party again, and they did not want to vote for the opposition. So they stayed home. That reminded me of a lot of Republicans in the United States that did not want to vote for Trump because of what Trump was all about. And then they did not want to vote for a Democrat. So they stayed home. So these are the main two reasons why we had lower numbers. And we can add a third one that obviously with years of sanctions and the maximum pressure campaign, you have a situation where people are in terms of engaging because of the economic condition, and that's also understandable. With regard to the issue of disqualification, I also share this idea that we wish there was a better process of disqualifying. In elections, obviously, all over the world, including India, there's a process of disqualification. But that's normally in India and elsewhere, that's done through political parties. So you join a political party, you go through that process of sort of rising in a political party, and sometimes you rise and sometimes you don't. And sometimes you get to run for office and sometimes you don't get to run for office when you are in a political party. And in Iran, we have over 100 political parties, but people don't have that culture of joining political parties, basically. And I guess that can be studied by political scientists and people who do political sociology. And why that is the case, it could be because the fact that the new government after the fall of the kingdom came through a popular revolution. It did not come through a coup d'etat. It did not come through a political party taking over. It was a mass movement. And
Doctor, 2 minutes, please.
Did not. Okay, no problem. Political parties did not take hold in Iran. So we have one body that does the qualification, and that's the body that it's a constitutional court, basically, does the qualification. And it's not a very efficient way. It doesn't look very good, to be honest with you. But there's no other choice, because you cannot have, we had 600 people registering to be the president, and you cannot have that. Iranian television gives equal airtime to everybody, and with 600 candidates, you cannot do that in practice. Let me just use my last minute to just say a few words on foreign policy. Raisi, President-elect Raisi, has been criticizing President Rouhani, but looking too much towards West, putting all his eggs in the basket of nuclear negotiations. And he has been advocating this policy of looking east. and sort of diversifying Iran's foreign policy, not worrying about appeasing or pleasing Western government. And that's why they call him a hardliner, because he doesn't want to follow Western lines when it comes to Iran's foreign policy. Western media calls him hardliner. And so this policy of looking east, it's not very complicated. It's going to mean looking at countries that are on the eastern side of Iran, which is China, which is Russia, which is India and Pakistan, and other countries that are non-Western countries, but are advancing scientifically. The wealth of the world is moving towards east. And so that policy of looking east is going to be something that President Raisi is going to follow. So we expect better relations with all these countries that I named, including India, given the fact that there are historical ties between India and Iran and cultural ties, and both civilizations are quite ancient. And I think looking forward, we can expect better relations with Iran, India, and other countries that I mentioned. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm going to be with you for some time.
Thank you, Dr. Fahd. Thank you very much. I think you have introduced also in your speech a very interesting point of firstly the economic hardship in the Iranian. It could be one of the reasons for the less voters, and also the pandemic, which also played a major role in reducing the number of voters. And these are two legitimate points that we need to take it further. And I believe that criticizing Rouhani being a pro-West and looking east, that is the new focus of Iran. And I'm sure with the deal with the Russian and with the Chinese, India also is a candidate to be one of the major players for Iranian investment on a bilateral project. Thank you so much. I would like to invite Dr. Lewis Kettle. Dr. Lewis?
I am here.
Yes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, distinguished panel. And thank you very much, GCTC, for inviting me and for organising this event. My research is on British foreign policy, so I suspect that I have been brought here to provide the British perspective as we see it from London. And in that vein, I'd like to kind of talk about four different things that have preoccupied certainly the Western media coverage of the elections, but also I think are important questions that have been going through British diplomacy and British foreign policy in relation to Iran recently. Anyway, the first is obviously the new president and working with President Raisi to the extent that British-Iranian relations allow working together. The media has focused on Raisi's judicial experience because that is where he spent a majority of his time. And we don't have a lot of information about his political credentials because he is not an experienced politician. And we will have to see where he tends to focus his attention within that realm. And also it was important to keep an eye on the kind of cabinet positions that he chooses to fill, because he will presumably take that into account, that he will need some experienced politicians within that as well. So as I say, the focus has been on his loyalty to the Supreme Leader, his judicial experience, his opposition to Rouhani in 2017 as running as a presidential candidate, and what that means in terms of what we can expect from him in opposition to what we've had for the last two presidential terms. The other things that has been mentioned quite a lot is his human rights record, in particular the focus on him being a member of the committee responsible for execution of political prisoners in 1988. And what that means for a relationship ongoing, And of course, he is the first Iranian president, or will be the first Iranian president when he's inaugurated in August, who is technically under sanction by the United States because of his association with the Supreme Leader and his office. So those are the things that have kind of come up in the general discussion in the lead up to the election, because he was widely expected to win as the front runner throughout. And the phrase that comes up repeatedly is a kind of hardliner, as we've said. And I guess from a British perspective, what we mean by a hardliner is conservative views which wish to be imposed. So the question from a British perspective is how to square some of Raisi's very different views to British perspectives. Britain had a security review at the beginning of this year published. It's something it does every 5 years, but the 2020 review was delayed because of the coronavirus. And in it, they really emphasized a renewed emphasis on focusing on human rights. And within that they have stated that they want to have a more active role in shaping the open international order of the future. What that means is very unclear, but there's a tension between how to work with the regimes which on the one hand are being described as, or people on the one hand, which are having questions over human rights history, and this renewed emphasis on the focus on human rights. And the result is that Britain will have to be pragmatic, I think, rather than idealistic. And that's fine. There are many areas of alignment with Iranian foreign policy. For example, we can talk about peaceful transition in Afghanistan, an end to conflict in Yemen, improvement of Gulf relations. These are all areas in which there is alignment to British policy. But of course, there are always also a number of areas of conflict. In particular, Iran's ongoing influence in Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, Sana'a, and beyond, as well as their opposition to the US and Israel. And from a very kind of British perspective, also some political, what they see as political prisoners being held. So the most widely covered case in British media is that of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, who's a dual British-Iranian national. But there is also a recognition that much of these issues are likely to be beyond Raisi's control. He's not in charge of the judiciary, and foreign policy is under the wing of the Supreme Leader and the IRGC. So working with Raisi is going to be a new challenge for the British government, but one which there are definitely roots in. The positives, of course, are that Raisi can now work with a kind of all-conservative regime, as it were. We've got a conservative president, conservative-dominated parliament, and the Supreme Leader is considered to be conservative in values. So more likely to be cohesive, although of course conservatives always have divisions within them as well, but more likely to be cohesive. The negatives is that whether there's questions around whether there will be any kind of challenge to existing status quo as a result of it. So that's the kind of first point, is how is Britain going to work with this new president, with Raisi, who politically is essentially an unknown quantity. But this is kind of what has been gathered so far. The second question was, there was wide concern over what the response would be to the election results in the run-up. As we have already heard, there was a considerable amount about the potential boycotting of the election. And there was also reference back to 2009 when there was widespread protest in response to the result. So there was concerns about this. Obviously, none of this has manifested, but there are many other challenges which could lead to political protests. We saw them through 2017 through 2020 over economy, fuel prices, the Ukrainian airline situation. But there are other challenges as well to the Supreme Leader. And the question about whether protests will erupt again is something that is of concern for the British, because how do they respond to that? In 2009, both the UK and the Americans considered that they did not get involved in that particular protest, but it was widely reported in Iran that it was stirred up by Western media. So in that case, they felt that they couldn't win either way. So what to do if that happened again? And in response to that, if protests do break out, how will the Iranian government and the Iranian regime respond? And what will that mean for this the British relations and broader international relations, especially the JCPOA negotiations, if there is any kind of what is perceived as any kind of brutal crackdown on protest? So there's those kind of questions floating around, and they are what ifs, but they're important what ifs under consideration. The third is, of course, what does all of this mean for the JCPOA, which is really important from a British and US perspective, as well as from the Iranian perspective. We are, as you mentioned at the beginning, we've had the final meeting of the 6th round took place on Sunday, and it also seems like there are a lot of positive noises coming from all camps that a solution should be reached. The feeling is that in reality, the election of Raisi will make a little difference to these negotiations. Completion of the JCPOA and moving forward with that is a state policy determined by the Supreme Leader, and that will not therefore change under Raisi. There is also some analysis, perhaps there is a push to get the JCPOA negotiations completed under Rouhani's watch, in order that if it ends up not being a successful deal, that he can be blamed for that problem. But whether that happens, we'll wait and see. But the wider problem is not that the JCPOA won't actually come to fruition, but that it may impact any kind of future discussions. The hope was that the JCPOA would be a cornerstone or a building block to future negotiations, to future relations. And some of the bigger discussions that are more challenging and more difficult would flow following them. So I'm talking about missile program proliferation and wider regional activities in particular. And those have been understandably off the table at this stage, but the hope has always been that perhaps once the initial JCPOA has been established, that it would provide a building block to further discussions about bigger issues. So there is concern about what does Raisi's election mean for those next steps, and whether it will have any difficulty in putting off investment into the country, even once the JCPOA has been agreed. So that's the kind of third point, is relation to the JCPOA. The fourth and final point of concern and thought that is going through the Western media is on long-term, much more long-term. And we've talked about this, as has been touched upon by other speakers, but succession of the Supreme Leader. Certainly in the Western media, it is widely touted that Raisi, if not Khamenei's son, are in the kind of top candidates for succeeding. But of course, Raisi's legacy will depend upon his economic success moving forward. In particular, it's a kind of risky business as to whether you can succeed as a president in any country. So his succession to supreme leadership will really depend on the next few years and whether he can turn the Iranian economy around. So those are the 4 things that I think are concerns from London, and hopefully they've sparked a number of issues to debate.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I think you have raised a very interesting questions, and we know that England was one of the major first country who have broke the jinx of not doing any business with the Iranian after the nuclear deal, that we had 171 member of a delegation with the Prime Minister visiting Iran, and they kept a low profile of coming back into South and Southeast Asia after Britain. And I'm happy and will be looking forward to read your books as well. I may invite Dr. Deepika Saraswati. She's a political geography from School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She is currently a researcher fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs. Her research focuses on the geopolitical issues on Iran and the Persian Gulf, sub-region, and wider West Asia. Her book titled Between Survival and States, The Counter-Hegemony Geopolitics of Iran will be published by Macmillan this year. So, dear Deepika, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Awad, for the kind introduction. Let me start by resonating what my Iranian colleagues have mentioned about the recent presidential elections in Iran. It's obvious that the Western media obviously tends to zoom in, and their reporting on the elections in Iran are very much shaped by their long-term political objectives. So, but here in South Asia, where Iran is part of our extended neighborhood, conversations like this become really important for us to have our own independent perspective on the developments in Iran, on elections in Iran. So the 48% electorate that turned out to vote in Iran is variously interpreted as actually a very record low turnout, or it can also be seen as that the 48% of the electorate turned out to support the Islamic Republic, given the elections are usually seen as kind of a referendum on the system. It can be interpreted in any which way, but one thing that is very clear is that the hardliners, the principalists, have really consolidated their position. Now they control not the judiciary and the parliament, and now with this election, they are in the most important, the highest office of the executive. So one thing that's clear, and we can be safely argued that the power struggle that is very characteristic in Iran between the elected and the non-elected power centers should abate, and there would be more cohesive government, so to say, like the kind of divisions that the administration between the foreign ministry and IRGC, something that was highlighted in this controversy. So what we can expect is a more durable nuclear agreement, given the conservative hardliner critiques of the agreement in 2015 will now be responsible for implementing it. So that's one. And then we may also expect a better convergence between the better convergence in terms of overall approach to foreign policy and regional strategy between the foreign ministry and also the other influential institutions, the IRGC. That having said that, I mean, we've seen that President-elect Raisi has already appointed, has formed a committee to ensure that the new agreement that is being negotiated in Vienna is in accordance with the 2015 agreement, which was approved by the Supreme Leader. So we see that Iran seems to be returning to normal. Seems to be returning to reviving the agreement and the international economy. So that's something that is important for a country like India, given the sanctions and the maximum pressure had really taken a toll on India-Iran ties. I'll come to that later, but before I'd just like to say a couple of things about the foreign policy and the regional strategy of President-elect Raisi. I think there's going to be, it's safe to say that there's going to be a fair amount of continuity, because we all know that the overall strategic inclination or the contours of the foreign policy in Iran are decided by the Supreme Leader, create a national consensus on the policy and implement it. So, however, there are going to be some differences also. For example, Rouhani administration had a very liberal view of Iran's engagement internationally, and had proposed a number of regional multilateral approach to resolving the regional tensions and a regional approach to security, which culminated in announcements like Hormuz peace endeavor. And but the hardliners, they have a different approach, which is seen as a realist approach, where they see Iran's regional involvement as a key source of Iran's power. And so IRGC, which only some months ago, the leader defended IRGC's role when, after Dr. Zarif's controversial remarks about IRGC, where he said that IRGC prevents what he called as passive diplomacy. So one can argue that under Raisi presidency, IRGC will continue to support the government of Bashar al-Assad and also other allied groups in Iraq, Lebanon, and elsewhere. While it's quite possible that that the new presidency may also support regional security dialogue, and much like Rouhani and maybe, but of course they will not talk to the United States on a follow-on agreement on missiles or regional activities, but they may but there may be a possibility of a regional agreement on these issues under the UN auspices, or even supported by China and Russia. So that is something I think that's crucial from Indian perspective in terms of a de-escalation of tensions between various regional players in West Asia. That's another development that India would be watching carefully. And coming to something that was referred by my Iranian colleagues is the Iran's policy of look to the east. So I think that is also going to continue under Raisi presidency. In fact, there would be more impetus. They would most likely double down on the economic diplomacy between with the Eastern players of China, Russia, India, Japan, etc. for the reason that the hardliners have usually they've been more cautious in terms of in their engagement with the West. So it's quite possible that they will double down on the Rouhani second term, this trajectory of look to the East policy 2.0. So that is going to continue. And once Iran returns to international economy with the revival of the JCPOA, I think the connectivity projects will get a new fillip. And given that Iran has long waited for lifting of sanctions so as to work on utilizing the potential of its geoeconomic location along the Persian Gulf Coast. I think there is a strong sense in Iran that it has missed on the connectivity or logistics developments into region, while the countries on the other side of the Gulf, like UAE and Qatar, have really taken advantage of their location. So Iran is obviously going to continue collaborating with India on Chabahar. I mean, only earlier this year, on March 4, during Chabahar Day celebration, Indian External Affairs Minister actually argued for expansion of INSTC to include Chabahar, and Chabahar therefore could potentially be the key node in an eastern branch of INSTC, going to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan by Afghanistan. So that cooperation will get new momentum with the lifting of sanctions. And also India could find opportunities in new ports as well. I think there are talks about Jas port outside the Strait of Hormuz. So I think there also India would have all the reasons to look for opportunities for cooperation. But the most important, I think, the pillar of cooperation or convergence, area of convergence between India and Iran would be Afghanistan. I mean, there is now a return of a regional approach to Afghanistan once again. Biden administration has talked about a regional aspect to peace process under UN auspices, which would involve 5 countries along with India, Iran, and Russia, which have a history of cooperation in Afghanistan, and also Pakistan and China. So there, I think the 2 countries have broad areas of convergence, as both are interested in stability of the country and managing the post-withdrawal security vacuum, and also making sure that Taliban does not dominate the Afghan polity, and and also contain the threats from ISIS and other extremist organizations. So these are some broad areas of convergence between India and Iran, and I think there is already some level of engagement. It can be which can be seen from the information available in the public domain. That is, after Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh's visit to Iran in September last year, when there was this talk of revival of a regional approach to stabilize Afghanistan, we've seen that Brigadier General Amir Atami visited India in February, and so it's safe to argue that there's going to be more of cooperation between India and Iran on Afghanistan theater. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepika. Thank you, distinguished speakers. And I think you have already touched a very important point throughout the debates. And I have learned many of the points which is of a great value, and it will have an impact on the future stability in Iran and also on relation regionally and globally. I see the Professor Hoshang Amir Ahmadi focused on the Iranian democracy, which is unique of its own. It's a very interesting discussion. It's an election that he called it a masterpiece I like the name of calling this election as a masterpiece, which is really a unique, because most of the people who felt that this election going to be, whether it is hard or soft, it's immaterial, because we don't see Iran from the American eyes only. We see Iran from the global eyes and as a regional and international players. And I'm sure this will also highlight and acquaint the public the real democracy in Iran and what could be the major shift in the foreign policy of Iran. I'm sure this will take the discussion forward with the I will introduce each of the speaker. He may feel free to make a final comment on this before I open the floor for the question and answer. But let me continue with my own understanding of the discussion so far. Ambassador Abdul Basit was very interestingly brought two major issues. And I think that is the role of Pakistan in the future of Iran stability also, because not only Iran, it's also the stability of Afghanistan and the stability of China, BRI, to name it, the economic corridors through Pakistan and Afghanistan and the rest of the countries where China ambition to continue with the BRI, which is close to around $1 trillion project in 135 countries. So I think this is an interest, but an Iranian concern is the security issues, which is a very important point of view. And I think Abdul Basit have a distinguished diplomat. I can understand from his career, he put it in a very, artistic manner and articulated by his foreign policy of Iran, of Pakistan in relation to Iran. I think the border problem is going to be for some time to come and exist in this region. So the China involvement also was very good point to raise, because I think there where the security concern of China is coming in focus, especially after the American withdrawal from the region, from Afghanistan, which they are fastening the steps of moving even before the 11th September anniversary. And already the United States have moved 50% of the American remaining troops and NATO's in Afghanistan. So let's see whether there will be any remnants of the American military base there or any forces to be left behind. It all depends on the future look how Afghanistan will go ahead. And I think these are two very interesting points that we see. Dr. Fouad Izadi has already focused on the 13th election of Iran, which is really of low election turnout, the pandemic, the political parties in Iran, and also Rouhani being criticized by the current president, because he was always seen as a pro-West. And I think looking East policy was one of the major issues that has to be focused. And I think that is the reason why Iran wanted, even the Ayatollah Khamenei wanted to see Raisi as the successor, not only because he's close to him, but I'm sure because he has a point to prove that he is able to move forward in the new direction of Iran, of not only looking east, but acting east. Dr. Louise Kettle, a very interesting point of view she has raised, and a very British perspective. And I always enjoy listening to the British low profile, revival of the British understanding of the region, which is very interesting to see how they have moved into the region very slowly for the last 1 decade. And I think a British exit, Louise, will add also of the European, after the European Union, will add more of influence of the Britain in this part of the world, because no one can understand the South Asia and Asian affairs more than the British, because they have colonized this part for long years. And I'm sure with your own point of view, you have raised of a human rights record, how they will see it, because not only Britain, but also the United States also see this as a major issue to be taken, not only in Iran, but in the rest of the world. And I think the conservative leader, this terminology of conservative, I think people will understand that supreme leadership have the upper hand in any kind of a major decision when it comes to the national interest of Iran. Let us all remember also that the Iranians are good in knitting carpets, and they spend years in making the carpets, but at the end of the day, they will give you one of the most beautiful carpets. You will enjoy it. That's how their foreign policy have been over the years. I think the pragmatism in the Iranian relation with the Britain will be very much in the focus, because I think Britain moved fast and swiftly into the region and understand how to settle issue when they can handle it in their own way. I will be happy to hear your final comment on this. And Dr. Deepika Saraswati have added to the discussion of the Indian concern and also the Western media focus on Iran. How did they see it? How do we see it from an Asian perspective? How Iran is important for the region of Iran and India will be more of a cooperation, especially after Shah Bahar, and what will be the main event of the cooperation in the economy, because that is the, not only as Ambassador Abdul Basit spoke about Gwadar, but also speaking of Shah Bahar from the Iranian perspective and Indian perspective, sidelining Pakistan will be of a great importance to see how India will be dealing not only with Iran, but also with the current scenario in Afghanistan and also the future relation with Pakistan, because at the end of the day, as I remember former minister, Jaswant Singh, foreign minister, he told me that you cannot choose your neighbor, but you have to learn how to live with them. I leave with my talk here, and I leave the floor open for each and every speaker who would like to make a comment. We have 2 minutes each speaker. Who would like to comment on your own or comment on, add to your point. I would like to ask Professor Amir Ahmadi to come forward and say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed the discussions and learned quite a bit. Let me take a broader perspective now. First, over the last 42 years, the biggest problem the Islamic Republic has had is to strike a balance between its ideology and the policy matters that in a world that it lives, that is between pragmatism and ideology. That has been their major challenge, and that challenge continues to stay. How that balance is maintained is a key issue. Second issue that we really need to consider when we talk about Iran is that Iran had a revolution 42 years ago. Now that revolution has been taken over largely by counter-revolutions. But really that revolution was expected. Almost none has been achieved in terms of like not only just economics. I'm talking about like in terms of the independence, in terms of like a more powerful Iran, in terms of the social justice, and the rest of it. So most people feel that the revolution has failed. And I think this election was a reaction. It was a reaction to that failure. And that now new group of people are coming, mostly revolutionaries and radicals, are saying we have to go back to 1953, ideas. And that is why we fought the Shah and others. What we got now is a parasitic, capitalism of merchants, of bankers, and corrupt people, and money launderers, and land usurers, and so on. And that is the source of Iran's problem. That is to say, we need to look into the fight between revolution and counter-revolution. Every revolution comes to that point, whether the revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries have to set the thing aside. They have to, one has to go. Either way, cannot go forever between them to fight. And the next issue, the third issue, I believe is very big and macro, is whether the Islamic Republic can maintain or want to maintain republicanism as a form of government. Ayatollah Khamenei, in a few speeches, one in just the beginning of the last year, Iranian last year, 1399, the 3rd of Farbardin in particular, he said very openly that the republicanism and Islam really doesn't come together. Forget that the Mr. Khomeini had a different concept of government. It was the Islamic government, not Islamic Republic. So he thinks perhaps at some point Iran needs to go back to the original idea that Mr. Khomeini put on table for the Iranians. In fact, in a speech, Mr. Khamenei just about 3-4 weeks ago, the 15th of Hordad, he made a very, very interesting statement. Nobody noticed. He said, this coming election is an election that we need to have this election. But he said, there comes a time, and he said it, there comes a time that election will be meaningless in the Islamic Republic. He said the election will be meaningless. For now, it is okay. What that suggests to me, given that idea that he had previously presented, is that Mr. Khamenei is looking forward to moving away from republicanism to a new form of government. Maybe he's thinking more in terms of an Islamic empire of some sort. But that is a fact. We have to consider that. And I think this new group of people that have taken the country with Mr. Raisi on the helm are very much in tune with this kind of ideas. So whether they can really make it to happen, I'm not sure. And finally, in the foreign policy, I agree. Again, in the foreign policy, the Islamic Republic has always been more pragmatic than ideological. It just works in a world of tremendous constraints. So when it comes to that point, they do all kinds of compromises. Like the JCPOA was a good example of the compromise. Although Mr. Khamenei and his people, at the bottom of their heart, did not like that JCPOA, but they felt imposed on them. But at the same time, they just had to go for it. And now again, they are going to go back to JCPOA, not for a practical, not for a sort of ideological reason or for a policy reason, but just largely because they just have to. So I think we need to basically, and then again, moving east, to me, is an issue. But the fact is, we all know that Iran is a country in between the East and the West. I think it is mistaken to just go for the East or the West. Iran has to balance that policy. In the beginning of the revolution, their slogan was neither East nor West, Islamic. Now they have come to the point where they say, they can either East or West. The fact is, I think they have to move in the direction of both East and West, because otherwise they will get lost in the middle of this strategic, very global strategic game that is being played, in the world scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Agha Sayyid Mustafa Khoshishim, he has already spoke of the reformist camp, and there was some camp against the supreme leadership and lack of understanding of Iranian democracy. He spoke of the people they wanted to changes actually, and major shifts in foreign policy. I think Agha Sayyid, if you can just enlighten us, what did you meant by this? People wanted change. Did they have more option? And what is the foreign policy seriously in Iran can be achieved? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again. Let me give a clear perspective of the election. Several months before this election, all the opposition of the Islamic Republic called for a boycott of this election, and they admittedly said if the turnout would be somewhere around 20–25%, they would have succeeded. And they failed, of course. But there have been a number of reasons why the turnout has been low. Of course, it's an honor that the world expects very high of Iran. Apparently, they are accustomed to large turnouts, but we have already had several rounds of elections, like the one that took Hashemi Rafsanjani to office for a second term, that stood in the vicinity of 50%. Like in that election, the turnout was a little more than 50 point something percent. We've had also presidential elections with 54–57% turnout in the past. But in this election, in addition to the 9–11% coronavirus factor that has lowered the turnout, and in addition to what Dr. Izzadi correctly said, that 4 million out of the 60 million people live abroad, and hundreds of thousands of Iranians live in Canada, which didn't allow Iran to hold the election in there. And in Singapore, Thailand, and a number of other countries, they had problems with coronavirus, and they said they were afraid that they couldn't allow Iran to hold the elections in those countries. In the UK, as Dr. Izzadi pointed out, unfortunately, the UK didn't cooperate with Iran to provide security for the voters. Unfortunately, in Birmingham, an Iranian family that appeared at the poll, a woman was beaten by the opposition of the Islamic Republic. You may not see such a thing anywhere else. They were, she was beaten in front of her son and husband for exercising her right to vote. And they captured it on the video and viraled it through the social media. So many were intimidated to appear at the polls abroad. In addition to all these factors, there was one more thing that I told one of the advisors of Dr. Hemmeti, the reformist candidate, then. I told him, if you continue this kind of campaigning method, you would fail definitely, because they were exercising old method of campaigning for the election. And they were talking about Islamic code of dressing. They were talking about social media, civil liberties. While this has been a worn out, stance and campaign method that has been in practice by President Khatami, President Rouhani, and many others. And the Iranian public has grown up. They've realized that these are just excuses to win the election and to win weight in the political sphere. And also, Iranians are concerned today, all Iranians, no matter who they are, where they live in Iran, from which political camp they are, it is economy. So when Dr. Hemmeti, the central bank governor, didn't have good planning for economy, and he underlined that he would continue President Rouhani's plan and moves and policies, he killed himself, actually, because he was telling the public that he would continue Rouhani's way and they would be, poor. So the campaigning was a problem for the reformists this time, of course. But what I'm telling you is that there have been a number of reasons why the turnout has come lower than 50%. And there needs to be studies. And in a session, when I was talking to spokesman of the Guardian Council vetting body, where Dr. Izzadi and a number of other Iranian elites were also present, I found him that he was, the Guardian Council is very much interested in conducting surveys and studies to understand the role of each factor. So the research center is now busy with studying the share of each of these factors to understand the motives and the reasons why the turnout has been at the 49% or so. But when it comes to foreign policy, well, Iranians voted for President Hassan Rouhani, whose main and only and single agenda, with no plan B, was détente with the West. For the past 20 decades, the United States and its European allies in the West, they have been trying to, contain Iran's power through the containment strategy that works through the carrot and stick policy, through sanctions and posing military threats as a carrot, as well as confidence building to, build confidence that if you're willing to resolve the conflicts, we are ready to. And then pushed Iranians to talks in 6 major agreements over Afghanistan, Iraq, 3 nuclear agreements between Iran and the 3 European countries, France, Germany, and the UK, and with the JCPOA being the last one. In the words of Western experts, even US officials, Iran has been in full compliance with its undertakings because it has held a strong belief that it's, the West is there at the talks for conflict resolution. But the United States and its European allies have defied their, undertakings because their end game and their objective and goal has not been conflict resolution, but it's been containing Iran's power in various areas of nuclear industry, missile industry, regional power, and God knows how long the list would continue. So for the past 8 years, Rouhani, with this single agenda of détente with the United States for the last time, he tried to remove the sanctions, improve Iranian economy, and unfortunately, he did not have any plan B. Iranians have learned after 8 years that critics of President Rouhani have a well plan, as during the election campaign on TV and elsewhere, they were speaking about it, as Hemmati was saying that he would continue Rouhani's path to work through the JCPOA as a pivot, as the core of his foreign policy. The others said that they have a new plan, and they guarantee that no matter what happens to the JCPOA, they can improve the situation. That's why I say, and I do believe, that although it's very difficult, cumbersome task for Raisi to improve the economy, but it's also, there are many potentials that have been left intact. He's got a very, a detailed plan for improving economy when it comes to foreign policy, and having learned the lesson from the past 20 years, especially the 8 years, he is going to, bring up a more balanced view to Iran's foreign policy. Because of Iran's focus on détente with the United States, Iran never did enough to expand ties with Latin America, with Africa, with China, Russia, with India, and many others in the region. Now Raisi is going to shift the balance. This doesn't mean it's going to be a radical change. This doesn't mean that the JCPOA would be gone. No, that means that JCPOA, as Raisi himself said, is not going to play a pivotal role in his foreign policy. The look to the East has been on the recipe for the past 30 years in Iran's foreign policy, but there has not been rigid and serious efforts to do that. Like the roadmap of cooperation with China, that remained over the table. We don't see any contracts under that roadmap, but Raisi means to really focus efforts to under this look to the East policy. That represents very unique, I do believe that it represents very unique opportunity for the region, because it's not just China and the Silk Road Initiative that Iran would join in the near future after Raisi comes to power, but also he has detailed planning for joining the South-North Indo-Eurasian corridor that for now, has remained on the pause for just $500 million of investment that Iran has, but nobody has done much to remove the problem in the railroad problem that they had in northern Iran in order to complete this South-North corridor. So
thank you.
He means to expand ties with these regional states.
Yeah, you made your point very interestingly. Thank you so much. Ambassador Abdul Basit, are you still there? Could you please come forward and enlighten us with your final comment, please? If not, I will, if Ambassador Abdul Basit is not there, then I can invite Dr. Fuad Izadi till Mr. Abdul Basit comes, then we can help. Mr. Aghay Izadi.
Yes, thank you very much. Since this is a webinar that is supposed to look at Iran from a specialist point of view, we are not on television, we are not making media appearances, we are actually talking about serious policy issues that deals with Iran's domestic and international policy. And that is the case, which I think it is. Gross simplification is going to lead us nowhere. So in Western media outlets, every year that there is a presidential election in Iran for the last 30 years, they claim that this person or the other person is the establishment candidate. This has been going on for decades now. And when President Khatami was running against Mr. Khatami, before he became president, was running against Mr. Nateq Nouri, who was the establishment candidate? Mr. Nateq Nouri. And then who won? Mr. Khatami, 2 times. Even Mr. Raisi, who won the election this time, ran 4 years ago, and he was the establishment candidate then. But who won? Mr. Rouhani won. 8 years ago, when Mr. Rouhani was running for The establishment candidate was Mr. Jalili. You go back to the media outlets at that time, everybody was saying that Mr. Jalili is the leader's representative at the National Security Council, and he's the establishment candidate. And who won? Mr. Rouhani, who was not the establishment candidate. So it is true that in every election, it's announced that there is an establishment candidate. And it's also true that this establishment candidate sometimes wins and sometimes loses. And that's how you get it in a democracy. So simplifying things, I think, is not going to be good for Iran's domestic policy. I put the link to Ayatollah Khamenei's speech that was referred to here on the chat box. And it's in English. So you're welcome to read it. And I think it's a good speech to find out what he actually thinks about republicanism and the role of the people in the Islamic Republic. And when you read through that speech, you realize that he emphasizes this point many, many times in that speech, that without popular support, you cannot have an Islamic Republic. And the basic point that he's making is that if you don't have a popular support for any government, you have to resort to tactics that would lead you to a dictatorship. You have to basically control people through power means. And then he considers that to be against the Islamic principles of engaging in those type of tactics. And it would not last. So the reason you have Iran's government surviving for the last 42 years is because there is a popular support. It's not 100%. Not all Iranians support the Islamic Republic, but there are enough Iranians that support the Islamic Republic that it has managed to survive. And that's why you have over 50% generally participating in elections because of that support. Iran's foreign policy, again, you can look at it in a simple manner, or you can look at it in a more sophisticated manner. You cannot have it both ways. We cannot say that JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, was imposed on Ayatollah Khamenei and he didn't like it. And in a few sentences, you say that Ayatollah Khamenei controls everything in Iran's foreign policy. You cannot have it both ways. If he didn't like JCPOA and it was imposed on him, so how is it that he controls everything? Generally, if you control everything, you don't do things that you don't like. I encourage our audience to read Iran's constitution. It's available online. Iran's foreign policy is made through this National Security Council. It's written in Iran's constitution. It has 12 members. 5 members belong to the executive branch. The head of the Iran's National Security Council is the president. And then the other 7 are people who are not in the executive branch. So you have the head of Iran's parliament as a member of the National Security Council. You have the head of Iran's judiciary as the head of the National Security Council. You have armed people in the military. So we have different centers of power in Iran, and this is a high-level National Security Council, and they come. But the reason we had the nuclear agreement was because out of 12 people, 5 people in executive branch, including President Rouhani, voted for that. You had Mr. Larijani, then Iran's Speaker of the Parliament. He voted for that. You had Mr. Firuzabadi, who was then Iran's Chief of Staff, the Army Chief. He voted for that. And you had enough votes. So I encourage people who are looking at Iran seriously, to look at Iran seriously. Don't go with the media flow. And if you look at it seriously, you can analyze Iran better. If you engage in propaganda, then you don't.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your valuable input. Is Mr. Abdul Basit is there, or should I invite Dr. Luis Kettle to come forward? I think Dr. Luis, you would like to make your final comment, please?
Thank you. I just thought I'd actually pick up on something that you mentioned, which was the impact of Brexit on this relationship. So Britain's exit from the European Union has, I think, kind of there's sort of three key things to think about in the wake of this from Britain's relationship with Iran, but also more broadly with the Middle East region. The first is that I think it has created a concern over how Britain is perceived widely, although I think despite perhaps Prime Minister Johnson's feelings, there is a wide understanding that Britain is not a great power, hasn't been for some time, but certainly I think the European Union can be considered one, and being part of that and an influential member of that had some sort of standing in the international community, and that has now gone. But Britain still wants to have some influence in the world, as its recent security review has proclaimed to. And it does see a role in the Gulf, as you say. It has a kind of historic role there. Whether or not it's true, it certainly feels that it knows the Gulf well, and perhaps there is an opportunity, especially with US withdrawal, to be involved. But secondly to that, actually, the security review has very heavily emphasized also a pivot more towards Asia. That is considered to be the threat in Britain as well, and that Britain is looking to support its kind of US ally in turning its attention that way. And so what does that mean is left in terms of resource in reality for elsewhere is a question that's not yet answered. The benefit, of course, of Brexit is that Britain can be a bit more nimble in reaction and act independently and quicker. But, as I say, there is a real issue of resources. So what it wishes to achieve and what it can achieve may be two separate things, especially in a post-COVID economy. So the impact of Brexit is not insubstantial here and in this ongoing relationship. But I think, as I said before, that there are definitely areas of alignment, no matter how different perhaps it may perceive that Iranian and British policy are. There are definitely areas of alignment that can be worked upon. And one that I didn't mention is, and I don't think has been mentioned that much, is improvement in Saudi-Iranian relations, which is something that was heavily encouraged within the West. I think tensions will inevitably remain, but improvements are possible. And of course, ending the conflict in Yemen would be a big step in that way. And Raisi has said that he wants to improve his relations in the Gulf and end that conflict. So I think that there's a lot of potential, if not complete unity, in lots of areas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kettle. I can see Mr. Abdul Basit is back, and Mr. Abdul Basit, we wanted you to have your final comment on this. If you can focus a bit on the, I know India of interest because we have Indian audience who would like to see how Pakistan is looking at the regional development, including Iran and Afghanistan and future relations with Iran. Please feel free with India. Unmute yourself, please. Yeah, unmute yourself. Yeah. I can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself. Aditya, please unmute Mr. Abdul Basit.
Ambassador Basit, you are on mute. Kindly unmute your mic.
Unmute your mic. Oh, he has lost the meeting. I think we can give him, let him come back. I can introduce again Deepika. Dr. Deepika, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I do not have anything more to add except that this conversation has been very useful. Some of the points that you sort of learn in your scholarship have been reinforced. That it's not useful to go for a simple, a simplified explanation to understand what goes on in Iran. It's a very complex polity with multiple power centers. So. That's something I think a useful takeaway for me, and that's all. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul Basit. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think all the speakers were spot on and greatly benefited from their insights. I would conclude by saying that, as I said in my earlier remarks, that Iran is an important country. And we would like to see it as actively participating in international relations. And we hope that the new government in Tehran would be conscious of its problems and would have a serious plan of action as to how to overcome issues which are related to sanctions, which are related to its nuclear program, and so on and so forth. And obviously, in sitting in Islamabad, we would like it to be playing some active role in the context of Afghanistan, as well as on seeing as to how it can play its role in bridging the gaps between Pakistan and India, because Afghanistan is a country which is friendly to both New Delhi and Islamabad. So it can play a constructive role in my view. And we'd all look forward to President Raisi be more active in the region itself. I mean, it is more active in West Asia, which is understandable, but it also needs to be more active in our part of the region as well, because it straddles both West Asia and kind of, is next to South Asia. So it has an important role, and we hope that it steps up to the plate, and that can happen only if its issues are resolved, particularly vis-a-vis the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have most of the speakers, distinguished speakers, have already put their point to the point. Everything is in order. And before I raise the questions which I have received, I just wanted to see if there is anyone of the audience would like to raise their hand. You can use the hand mark, and then they can ask a question. So if anyone would like to ask a question from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand and put your question and introduce yourself. I'll give a minute till we see who is online who would like to raise a question. Aditya, if you're seeing people I can't see, please let you also help me out on this.
Definitely, sir.
Okay. Okay, I don't think any. There's a question to Professor Amir Ahmadi. How does the American see the new president of Iran? Do you think that the human rights issues and the hard conservative, he can be of impact on the future relation with America in particular?
Thank you. For now, the Americans have not spoken a word about Iran's election. They are quiet. Because they are focused on the JCPOA, and the matter of this election is very sensitive in the US, given a lot of people on both sides that oppose the Islamic Republic. One thing I have to say is that traditionally, Democrats have been tougher against Iran that the Islamic Republic than the Republicans have been. In fact, I would say over 70% of all sanctions on Iran have been imposed by the Democrats. And in fact, perhaps even of that sanctions, 60% from two presidents, Clinton and Obama. So I think to expect leniency on the side of the US for the Islamic Republic is not warranted. But then again, Americans are increasingly pragmatic. They have been, of course, that's their philosophy of life. But particularly in most recent years, Americans have been very pragmatic, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. And they are trying to get off the Middle East, and they are pivoting toward China and the Pacific. So again, they are trying their best to extract themselves, and they don't want to get into any complicated relations with Iran beyond what already exists. So I don't expect the US be very forthcoming in US-Iran relations, given this new administration. But at the same time, they will stay with the JCPOA and, of course, try to extend it beyond that to the other issues, which obviously is off the table for now. So again, bottom line, I think the Americans are going to have to keep a low profile on the election and on Mr. Raisi, focus on the JCPOA and some of the issues they have with the US. I don't think the human rights will become a major issue. The American issue at that moment is the nuclear, the missiles, and the Iran's involvement in the region. And I believe the last is even more important than the first. That is, most people think that the nuclear issue is the key to American concerns. I believe that is not. The reason the nuclear issue became such a big thing for US is because that is where they can create international coalition against Iran. The real issue is the Iran's extension and involvement in the region, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Yemen and elsewhere. So I think at some point in the near future, Americans are going to have to come back and say, listen, everything resolved, but as long as you behave the way you do in the Middle East, vis-a-vis our quote-unquote friends or allies, it's not going to have to work. So again, and I think it's a major issue out there, and I'm very concerned because I have spent 35 years trying to mend this relationship, and I know all the parties involved, but I also know that is a very tough, if not impossible, relation to work at. So let's see, let's hope.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fouad Ijazi, the question is, there was a criticism of Mr. Rouhani tenure. Do you see more of the corruption charges against the previous officials will be one of the major issues for the President, Raisi? Unmute yourself, please.
Sorry. Mr. Raisi was a judge all his life, and one of his campaign slogans, one of the main campaign slogans was sort of engaging in providing a more just society. You know, in Christianity, we have clerics, especially in the Catholic Church, that have this liberation theology background. They consider the role of the church and the role of the priests as providing for the poor and helping with social justice issues. The founder of the Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, was an Islamic version of liberation theology. That's why he always talked about the poor, the mustaz'afin, and the worry that a lot of Iranian government officials had in the last number of years is that the Islamic Republic is not doing enough for the lower segments of society, because this lower segment of society was the main supporter of the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic provided for that segment. So corruption obviously is not going to be something that's accepted on social justice issues, and also in terms of the image that the country will have domestically and internationally. So that's going to be a focus of Mr. Raisi. He belongs to that same liberation theology school of thought. He's a cleric, and he talked about this providing for the poor extensively when he was running for presidency. And one reason may be interested in continuing negotiations on JCPOA is because he's just starting his administration. He needs money, and he wants sanctions relief. He has incentives to engage in that. And yes, my long answer to that short question is that former officials that have misconduct in their portfolios, have done wrong things, are going to be dealt with under the judicial system. Whoever takes over Mr. Raisi's position as the Chief Justice will pursue those cases. But I don't think it's going to be that big issue, because generally people who work with Mr. Rouhani were clean. So we had few people that faced difficulties, but generally his ministers and other people did not have corruption problems, and so we don't expect a huge issue on that matter.
How much, Mr. Abdul Basit, you spoke of the Gwadar and you spoke of Shah Bahar and China connection, but do you see a reapproachment between India and Pakistan can make the Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline still a possibility?
I don't think that it depends on rapprochement between Pakistan and India. That is one part, but the other part is Iran itself, because India is reluctant. There is one reason Pakistan-India relations, but other part is Iran's isolation, quote unquote, its sanctions, US sanctions in particular. So I think even if, first of all, there is no possibility in the near future that Pakistan-India relations come back on track. On the other hand, we hope that US sanctions in particular are lifted against Iran, and that is a possibility in the future, but I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future, so to say. But I would not rule it out at all altogether, because connectivity, such projects which are in our mutual benefit are possible, and I'm sure that if political situation improves, such projects would get some impetus when the time comes.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there was a question, if I understood, to Dr. Lewis, if she's still there. It's talking about the no colonialism, no traditional occupation by old powers. How does Britain going to play a major role in Asia?
It's a very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, no, well, I think the reality is, Britain's aware that it's very kind of sensitive about its colonial past and tries to step very carefully in these areas as a result, or believes it to. However, it has got a bit of a problem, because Britain sees itself as a benign force, but of course it's not perceived like that from elsewhere. It still has a kind of paternalistic perspective, which is colonial in nature, and it's not got over that yet. So really, it has a lot of challenges to balance in terms of its participation and in other regions in the world, either in the Middle East or in Asia. I think the reality is that it doesn't have the resources to do that much in Asia. So if it was going to focus, it would have to be more in the Middle East region, where it already has a number of resources, and I'm talking kind of security resources and also diplomatic posts. And I think actually it would be unwise of it to spend too much of it in Asia, which is going to be dominated by the US anyway. So it speaks in its language in its latest review about being much more active in shaping the international order of the future, but it doesn't really give any description as to how to be active. The kind of international order that it perceives is based upon values of kind of human rights, international justice, and those kind of areas, which aren't, of course, agreed upon internationally. And different people have different views on whether these are, in fact, quote unquote, universal. So it is a difficult line for Britain to tread. The colonial past does weigh, actually, up against what some people may think, does weigh quite heavily upon British diplomats, and how to approach things with that in mind. But it also now has as you mentioned, a challenge to establish itself outside of the European Union. So I think Britain now has this kind of slogan that it's moving forward, which is global Britain. But there's still a lot of debate about what that really means, and what that engagement actually entails. So I'm not sure I can actually answer the question very fully. Sorry, you're on mute.
I know it's very difficult, but I wanted to at least get your little point of view on this, especially in a webinar. But the final question, I have a question, if I may have been allowed to ask before we give the floor to Aditya to do the vote of thanks. I wanted to raise this question to Dr. Amir Ahmadi. Dr. Amir Ahmadi, US and Iran have lots of things in commonality on the ground. And we have seen that so much in common and lots of loss for the American businessmen in doing business with the Iranians. But when it comes to the West Asian affairs and the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, as we call it, West Asia here, there is always the Israeli-centric, which have never changed the American mindset. Though it is in the nuclear deal you talked about of the missile technology, but that's what makes the American worries, because Iran technology, and especially in the missile technology, is worrisome not only for the American, but also for the European Union. If I ask you the question here, does the American who look at the pre-Khomeini era as Iran as the watchdog of the American interest, would it be possible for the American to see the current government as doing the same job, if there is more of a convergence of politics, or convergence of point of view with the current government?
Thank you. A very good question. First, I think the ball is in Iran's court as opposed to American. As I said, Americans are pragmatists, and they have been on both sides of trying to make Iran a more powerful state in the region, and at the same time, when it didn't work, to make it a weaker state. So Americans can go both ways. And the reason they go both ways is because what Tehran does influences them. Like during the Shah was a friend of the US, and therefore they didn't mind to give Iran whatever it needs to become a regional influencer, and to even represent American interests in the region. But with the Islamic Republic, that whole idea collapsed. The Islamic Republic came out of a revolution. It's a different ideology. They were looking for independence and looking for sort of a government that has a right to its neighbors as opposed to the American being around there and so on. So again, can the Islamic Republic really change direction towards an Iran that existed before the revolution? I think it's hard. It is impossible almost to think of that way, because, as I said, the Islamic Republic is born of an ideology, a revolution and ideology. And that ideology from the day one has stood between the US and Iran. There has been many, many times that I personally have tried not only to mend, but I have come all close to bringing them together. Back in 2000, for example, I brought Secretary Albright, who was the secretary at the time, to extend an apology to the Iranian people for the 1953 coup. But the response from Tehran was disastrous, for example. In fact, Mr. Khatami called it a lost opportunity. And there have been many other opportunities. I think the Islamic Republic from the day one had an assumption that it has operated on that basis vis-a-vis the US. And that assumption is that the United States is bent to destroy this revolution. That assumption has really guided the Islamic Republic's policy toward the US. And as a result of that, they have come to a very interesting position, I mean, the Islamic Republic, vis-a-vis the US. And that is neither war nor peace. I neither wanted to have war with you, nor I don't want to have peace with you. And they have been able to maintain this status quo of no war, no peace. And in fact, countries in the region have also accepted that as a de facto position. Even Israelis have accepted it, Arabs have accepted it, Europeans have accepted it. Everybody in the region is very concerned about, sort of like changing that balance, the balance between war and peace. None of them want peace, none of them want also war. So that's the key problem. I believe the United States and Iran moving forward, they have either way. I think the United States or Iran will say, listen, no war, no peace doesn't work. All right, either war or peace. Okay, but
thank you.
I remember I put that to the State Department once, some years ago, and you know what they said? The Islamic Republic, they said, Hussein, this is a very dangerous formula. What if Iran accepts war? I said, God forbid. You mean Iran will accept war with you, America? What I'm saying is, the Americans were really afraid that if they were to take this position of either war or peace, the Islamic Republic may even take war. I mean, that's a telling story I heard directly from American foreign policy makers. I mean, the foreign minister, to be exact. Again, I think as long as Mr. Khamenei rules the country, I think this no war, no peace is the position. I don't think he will move in either direction.
You made your point. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting input and valuable input from you. I found Mr. Anand Jeshit, he wanted to raise a question. Anand, please introduce and let me know to whom you are raising your question.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for such an insightful addresses. Sir, my question would be more based upon what would be the reaction by India. So I think it would go to one who...
Deepika?
Yeah, maybe. But others may also address the... Sir, first, I mean, all the three questions are related to the new leader being associated with the hardliner group. So the first one is, if I'm not wrong, he is termed as one of the two judges of death who gave a verdict regarding the 1988-89 things. So if I'm not wrong, US sanctioned the leader, and then now there would be, I mean, India need to be have a balance between the West and this new Iranian leader. So one thing is that. Second thing is there have been repeated calls by the Iranian supreme leader regarding supporting the Kashmir related terrorism. So now this new leader also being associated with the hardliners group. I mean, what would be the India's response to it? Third one is like we know that last year only the Iranian government had nearly $400 billion deal with the China, and I think that one is the biggest one deal which any country has made with the China in history. So now the new leader is also looking forward with having the look east policy. So it will give a more weight for China to intervene in the Iranian affairs, and it will go against the India's interest. So I would like to know about what could be the response of the Indian government.
Okay, thank you. I think you raised three important questions. I may take the first question of the rule of President Raisi in 1988-89 rules and the verdict by the court. If I don't know if any would like of the speaker, maybe Dr. Fuad would like to focus on this.
Yes, I can speak about that. You know, in earlier days of the Islamic revolution in 1980, we had Saddam Hussein attacking Iran. And this resulted in an 8-year war. Many people were killed in that war. It ended in 1988 with the UN finding Saddam the responsible party for starting the war and attacking Iran. This may be a little bit difficult for our Indian brothers and sisters to accept. But we had some Iranians who helped Saddam during the Iran-Iraq war. The MKO organization was fighting on the side of Iraq against its own country. The reason I say it may be difficult for people to understand that is that generally, if a country attacks you, you don't have people siding with the country that's attacking. But unfortunately, we had this organization, which is a cultish organization. It was on the US list of terrorist organizations for many, many years. And they were responsible for killing 17,000 Iranians. So people who were pro-revolution in the earlier days of the Islamic Republic, 17,000 were killed. Some members of this organization were imprisoned, and in Iran we have the death penalty, like the United States. I don't know if India has death penalty or not, but we have the death sentence for people who kill people. So members of this organization, some of them who were in prison, had death sentences done through a judge, and then you had, when there's a death sentence, you need to have the Chief Justice also approving. So they had gone through that process, but the death sentence were not carried. And once the war ended in 1988, this organizations, MKO, attacked Iran using Saddam's weapons. And once that happened, the country decided to carry these executions. The people who, and the numbers, the MKO claimed that there were 5,000 people who were killed, but they never presented any facts, any data, any names. There were some people who were executed, had their sentences carried out. And at that time, there were a 3-judge panel that organized this execution. And Mr. Raisi was not on that panel. Mr. Raisi's boss at that time was on the panel. So just a few facts. Number one, the people who were executed had execution sentences because of their activities killing citizens in Iran. So they were guilty of murder, basically. Fact number two, the 5,000 figure is exaggerated. Fact number three, Mr. Raisi was not on that panel. He was in the judiciary, but he was not in that panel. But you know, generally facts sometimes don't matter when it comes to U.S. sanctioning officials. You have Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, who is sanctioned by the United States. And you know, we have very few high-ranking Iranian officials that are not sanctioned. The Americans, especially during the Trump administration, sanctioned everybody that they could put their hands on, and that's what you have. And I'm sure once Mr. Raisi starts his administration, this story of 1987 will surface many times. So they are looking at sort of methods of pressuring Iran, and this is going to be something very useful for them. It's nice looking, it's a humanitarian issue, and they will use it, and it will have an effect on Iran's foreign policy. But 18 million people who voted for Mr. Raisi all knew about this history, and they voted for him regardless of the story that I just talked about, because Iranians generally hate MKO because of their terrorist activity.
You made your point. I got
Mr.
that.
Awad,
Yeah,
can I inject a few
yes,
remarks?
Mr. Amir Ahmadi. Yes, please.
This is a very extremely important subject, and I know Dr. Izadi is close to Mr. Raisi and his people, and I really wanted to use this opportunity to ask Mr. Izadi to be more helpful in resolving this matter. I, for one, believe that we Iranians have to make a pass into history and move forward. We could forgive, but unfortunately, issues of that magnitude cannot be forgotten. Just this week, Mr. Raisi had an international press conference. In that press conference, this question was asked of him, whether he was involved in that massacre, whatever you call it, 5,000, 3,000, I mean, these are numbers. Doesn't matter, 2,000, it's a big number. And he said that he believes in human rights, that he is a supporter of the human rights, and he started talking about that. But unfortunately, he missed an opportunity. And the opportunity was that, listen, I was 18 years old or 19 years old. You know, I was in a revolutionary process. Everybody was killing everybody. We were all concerned. We were afraid. And this mistake happened. So I asked for forgiveness. He could have said that, and he could have put everything at rest. By the way, he did not say in that press conference that he was not a member of that committee. I'm not saying that Mr. Izadi is lying, of course not. What I am saying just simply, he missed that opportunity as well to make it more transparent as to how that developed. And finally, I think it is extremely important that we take a larger view of that massacre. After all, Mr. Izadi, you know that not everybody was a mujahid that was killed. There were mujahid, there were lefties, there were nationalists, there were lots of other people. Second, all of these people were already in jail. They were not in the war front. They were not captured at the war front. That they would be your POW and you would kill them or ours. They were in the jail for months. They were in the jail. So I think the bottom line, I think I'm going to beg Mr. Izadi and people like Mr. Izadi who are close to Mr. Raisi to go and talk to him and ask him to make a few very courageous daring statement about this past, ask the Iranian people, okay, for forgiveness and to move forward. I tell you why, because I can tell you honestly, after all, I have to say that, I mean, Mr. Izadi knows, I have, for the last 20 some years, been on the side of the radicals in Iran. I am not. I mean, this is a very fact. You know, I have been on the side of Mr. Izadi. He knows that for fact about JCPOA and many other issues. But I think Mr. Raisi has a serious problem that it will face soon. He has to go out. And I tell you, he's going to be around. If he wanted to be around, it's going to be impossible. I cannot even imagine Mr. Raisi coming to New York to participate in the UN, assembly this year or next year or the year after. I think he has to put this behind him. And for that, Mr. Izadi and his people really have a role to play, and I beg them to do so.
Thank you. Dr. Fuad, would you like to put a comment on this?
Yes, very briefly. I agree with Professor Amir Ahmadi that he missed an opportunity when that question was asked to have a clear the issue. For example, he could say that he was not part of that committee. He has said that many times previously, but in that press conference he did not say that. That's true. So I agree with him that he could do a better job. You know, Mr. Raisi is not really a politician; he's a judge, and so I think he will go through the learning process of how to handle the media and how to do that. So the second issue is that I did not vote for Mr. Raisi, and I voted for one of the other candidates, and I'm not in his campaign. And generally, I think again, I think the people who are close to him or are on his campaign should work with Mr. Raisi on that issue. And as I said, the people who were executed, you have some countries, European countries, other places that don't have the death penalty. In Iran, we have the death penalty. If you kill someone, you generally get the death penalty. And the people who were in jail had the death sentence on them. It was not carried. It was not carried because you don't want to. If you can avoid or delay carrying death sentences, that would be good. Then this organization attacked Iran using Saddam Hussein's weapons. The sentences were carried. So it is true that they were in jail, but they were in jail because of killing people, and that's what happened. Please unmute yourself, Dr. Awad.
Dr. Deepika, would you like to take the second question regarding the stand on Kashmir of the new government of Iran? Will there be any changes and India response?
Sure. I think I would just reiterate what I said in my earlier remarks, that relations between India and Iran are shaped by the fact that they share the same geography and both consider each and there are areas of common interest in Afghanistan or energy partnership and things like that. They are independent of the two countries' other partners. Like India has a partnership with the United States, Iran has burgeoning relations with China. I mean, that is a factor, but it's not a determinative factor. So last 2 years during the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, India-Iran relations took a hit, the economic relations. So, of course, I think there was some sense of disappointment in Tehran because Tehran expected that India would, take a stronger, stance on American sanctions and will continue pursuing relations, but somehow that did not come about. So I think it was more as an instrument of pressure that the Iranian leadership was taking rather unfavorable stances on Kashmir or on the Indian Muslim question during last year's Delhi riots. So those kind of comments have to be seen in the particular context of the last year and then the wider situation of India-Iran relations. So I think it has less to do with who is in power, whether it's moderate or a hardline. I think that's not particularly relevant to the issue. So I think as the relations improve, I do not see that Iran will have a reason to sort of do this kind of political grandstanding. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if Sayyid Mustafa Khoshashim is there.
May I just withdraw from the panel? Unfortunately, I have to go. I just wanted to say goodbye and thank you all, and I enjoyed it and look forward to talking to you again. Okay, I just have to go. I have another interview coming.
I think I will ask Mr. Yash Singh to come forward and put the vote of thanks before you leave, because we need to mention you on the vote of thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. And thank you so much. But I will ask Mr. Khoshashim to answer the question regarding the $400 billion investment in between Iran and China. How do you see this? Is it seriously going to be a long-term relation? Can the West digest this kind of relation away from their own interests is being taken by the Chinese?
That was the offer that was raised by the Chinese president some 6 years ago in a visit to Tehran after Saudi Arabia. But no specific number has been mentioned for this roadmap of cooperation that has recently been, worked between the two sides. But it's widely believed that that could be the number eventually in practice, but it's not been mentioned yet. Yes, sure. Iran under President Raisi will go under some kind of fundamental change. First of all, Raisi's agenda is, based on developing domestic economy, then ties with the region as well as other, world countries like Russia, China, India, and others that are willing to work with Iran on equal footing. And one of the major ones is China. And despite the very fact that Rouhani, it was under Rouhani that this roadmap of cooperation was discussed, or was brought under discussion, still, he was not, he didn't look very much serious about, putting it into contracts. Under Raisi, this roadmap of cooperation is one of the major elements in his foreign policy, not only because of reinvigorating Iran's economy, but also with regard to the JCPOA in confrontation with the United States. If the US revives the deal under Rouhani, it would be respected by Raisi. But if not, then there will be a change, a major change in Iranian policy towards the US. The negotiation would still be an option, an instrument, but not the only one as it was under President Rouhani. There would be a complementary package based on the strategy given out by the revolutionary camp. Alongside the negotiations, there will be, lowering the impacts of the U.S. sanctions. Sanctions have been the weapon of choice and leverage for the United States to force Iran to go to the talks and to give concessions to the U.S. Therefore, very rationally, diffusing the impacts of the sanctions or lowering the impacts is one of the main things to be done by President Raisi. In doing so, expanding ties with China is one of the main moves that he needs to make. Also, another complementary policy in this regard, with regard to the U.S., is increasing leverages that Iran has, not just in nuclear or military areas, but also Iran has so many leverages in all the tough, hard, semi-hard, and soft areas of power. And Tehran would go for that if the US avoids reviving the nuclear deal and removing the sanctions, as a matter of fact. That's what matters to Iran, removing the sanctions based on the contents of the JCPOA. This doesn't mean that Iran would go for a confrontation with the U.S. as the Western, establishments and states and media would like to portray. No, these pressures and all this package is done in order to force the U.S. shift its strategy from containment to a conflict resolution approach and to respect the nuclear deal and remove the sanctions. In doing this, alongside activating domestic economic potentials and expanding ties with the regional states, expanding ties with Latin America, Africa, Russia, China, India, and especially China is a major element. Therefore, Raisi is very much serious about that. There is a reason why Mr. Putin, the Russian president, and Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, were among the first to rush to congratulate him. Yet, I would like to add in the end that it doesn't mean that Iran has had a foreign policy that mainly focused on détente with the US for 8 years. Now, Iran would ignore the West and would just look to the East. No, there will be a fundamental change, as I explained earlier and now, but it would be logical and rational. Iran would not summarize Europe in the troika of the UK, Germany, and France, as it's been doing in the past 20 years. Iran's planning under Raisi entails expanding ties with other European states that are willing to cooperate with Iran, like Spain and Italy. So I believe we would witness a wider strategy-based perspective in foreign policy, which would be more balanced, trying to make the most from the existing potentials. That's the main agenda, all for economy. It's an economy-oriented, foreign policy, which entails increasing export through increasing foreign trade. And for that to happen, Iran needs to do détente with many actors in the region. And in doing this, I would like to also answer the question about India, and if India would be antagonized at the after Iran goes for expanding ties with the Chinese. This is not the case. As a matter of fact, it depends very much on India to show enthusiasm for working with Iran despite the US sanctions. But we believe that we could also expand ties with China, especially when it comes to the Indo-Eurasian corridor, the South-North corridor. But still, Iran would not miss the option of expanding the strategic cooperation with the Chinese and in order to reinvigorate its economy and counterbalance the US and diffuse the US pressures. Definitely, that's top on his agenda. And as soon as Raisi takes power, I believe in the first coming months, we would see a major leap in the ties between Iran and China.
Thank you so much for your concluding points. And I would like in the final word to say that Iranian election has proven again that it matters for Iran and for the world that democracy still exists and there are fair elections in Iran. It's the people power. There will be lots of economic challenges for the current president. He is president under sanction. He will face lots of difficulty in rejuvenating the Iranian economy. But if I may say so, because of my deep relation and visiting the country frequently for the last 4 decades, I would say that the amount of achievement Iran have achieved over the decades have proven again that despite the sanction, they were able to stand and they were able to prove that they can be a nation to reckon with. And I think the cooperation with the current government, with the USA, with the European Union, with UK, Russia, and China is going to be a major part in reshaping also the international new world order, because there where we are finding a new alliances, whether it is the American camp, whether it is the Chinese camp, whether it is the European Union, where they are trying to find the mid path between the two camps. And I would say that also that this cooperation and the future relation all depends on how the big powers also will play, whether the America-centric, China-centric policy will have its impact on the new development in this world is yet to be seen. I wanted to give the mic finally. Thank you, everybody, every distinguished guest that have spoken, and I learned a lot today from all of you. I'd like Yashi Singh from the GCTC to come forward and deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you.
I would like to thank our honorable speakers who have participated in the conference and have enlightened us with some pertinent points amidst the discourse. I would like to mention some relevant points made by our eminent speakers in no particular order. Like Mr. Sayyed talked about how the Western media and scholars look at the Iranian democratic process from a biased view, and how the Iranians looked for the change in power holders after every 8 years. Not just this, how further the relevant point made by Mr. Sayyed was that how new government in Iran is going to have a paradigm change in its foreign policy. The next we have Dr. Ford Izadi, who talked about the causes behind lower turnout in the Iranian election can be described in 3 ways. The COVID pandemic, the voters like neither the ruling party nor the opposite. And lastly, that how Iran does not have a political culture of people actively joining political parties. Then Dr. Lucy, who talked about there are 4 major concerns. She talked about how there are 4 major concerns in Britain regarding the new Iranian government. How to deal with the new government in Iran. Second, how to respond if there is another protest in Iran. Third, will the new government make any difference to JCPOA negotiations and further issues like nuclear proliferation? Then we have Dr. Hushang, who talked about that how challenging it is in terms of tackling economic crisis, revolution and counter-revolution, and also how to bring balance in foreign policy. And lastly, we have Dr. Deepika, who talked about India and Iran have a scope to strengthen their relationship as both the country aims peace. Thank you so much, all the participants, for enlightening all the attendees with such a fruitful discussion. I would also like to thank all the attendees who enthusiastically put in their question to the panel. I would also like to have more. We are also hoping for more fruitful discussions on the particular topic as we go ahead. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.